unpleasant surprise in the unemployment numbers out today. Jobless claims went back up. 870,000 Americans filing for first-time unemployment benefits last week. That's about 10,000 more people than the week before. And it's a sign that the improvement we've been seeing on the jobs market is not only slowing down, but it actually might be sliding backwards. NBC News business and technology correspondent Ling joining me now. Joe, it feels like we make 2 steps forward in this economic recovery, 1 step back. What states are having the biggest problems here? Where are the layoffs?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're in the middle of a very sluggish and maybe stalled jobs recovery right now. The states that have been hit the hardest, of course, right here in California, New York, Georgia, New Jersey, Florida, Texas, all hit really, really hard. Now, I want to look at the numbers a little more closely here, because in addition to the 870,000 jobless claims that were filed last week, you have another 630,000 pandemic unemployment assistance claims filed as well. All of those are new. So you do the math. You've got 1.5 million people filing for jobless claims, some kind of benefits, for the first time ever in just 1 week. And I know it's easy to think that this is no longer a headline anymore, but that's still 3 times the normal amount that we had pre-pandemic, if you can even call that normal, right? 3 times. And we're 6 months into this. And so benefits are going to start running out. That aid provided by the president, that stopgap measure after the $600 a week checks were gone, that's running out in most states right now. And if you think about it, 1.5 million people filing for new jobless claims. I did a little math on this. The Staples Center, the home of the LA Lakers, that can hold up to 20,000 people. We are talking about 75 Staples Centers worth of people who just filed for new unemployment claims. It's staggering. The pain is so real, Allison.
Yeah, Joe, it's crazy when you say it like that, and that's just 1 week. That's just 1 week in this. It just isn't going away at all. Let me ask you a little more specifically about California. I know you've also been dealing with the wildfires there, and there have been some unique situations with unemployment. What's going on in your state?
Yeah, in California, we've been plagued by fraud in the unemployment system. So you saw some unusual spikes in pandemic unemployment assistance claims over the past few weeks. And the state government is telling me that they've been plagued with issues of fraud and cybercrime, people trying to steal identities and then use those identities to steal unemployment money that's allocated for people who really need it. So what they've done is they said, look, we are so backlogged with claims. We have this fraud. We're shutting everything down for 2 weeks entirely, pressing pause on the system to get things straightened out, to clear up the backlog, and then put in new security measures, which, by the way, include taking a selfie and submitting that as one form of verification.
Oh, my goodness, Joe. Oh, boy. All right. Last question for you. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Fed Chair Powell, they were talking to the Senate Banking Committee today about the CARES Act. That's, of course, the coronavirus relief that ran out in July. What do they say we need to really get this economic recovery going? As you've been saying, it just feels like it's stalling out.
Yeah, it really does. And so there's been talk of reallocating some of the money from the $2.3 trillion relief package there. And so the idea here is they said that you have $200 billion allocated to Treasury that could be reallocated to maybe businesses and individuals. Then you have $130 billion left over, apparently, in the PPP program. And Mnuchin, Secretary Mnuchin, was saying that they can get that money and push that out if they can get congressional approval. So get that reallocated, and another $75 billion in the Main Street lending program, I believe it's called, that's also available. So that might be some more stopgap money. But what unemployed workers are telling me is that they want a real solution from the federal government. We're heading into the holiday season. We're heading into month 7 of this crisis, and there's no real long-term or even medium-term solution. So a lot of people are saying, look, the economy is the #1 thing I'm voting on. It's what I have to deal with every day. Where's the plan?
Yeah, a lot of people asking that question, Joe. Thank you so much. I hope when we catch up with you next Thursday, it's with some slightly better news.
Fingers crossed, Allison, always.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.